The void between stars had never been so crowded, and Admiral Cathera of the Vrithian Dominion stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Sovereign Eternal, watching the sensor displays with the quiet satisfaction of a predator who had already won the hunt before it began. His 7 elongated fingers curled around the command railing, the bioluminescent patterns along his neck cycling through deep violet, the color his species displayed when experiencing what humans might loosely translate as smug certainty. 347 warships stretched out behind him in perfect formation, their hulls gleaming like polished obsidian against the infinite dark, and every single one of them carried enough firepower to reduce a small moon to drifting rubble. The Vrithian Dominion had spent 40 of their long years building this fleet, feeding it resources stripped from conquered systems, fueling it with the labor of 17 subjugated species, and sharpening it against the bones of civilizations that had dared to call themselves powerful. And now, finally, it was pointed at the one prize that had eluded them, annoyed them, and frankly embarrassed them in front of the galactic community for the better part of 2 decades. Earth. Humanity. Those strange, soft, short-lived creatures who refused, with breathtaking stubbornness, to simply accept their place in the natural order of the universe. The story of how humanity had become the Vrithian Dominion's primary obsession was one that older admirals whispered about with something uncomfortably close to reverence, though none of them would ever admit it. It had started with first contact, 17 years ago by the human calendar, when a Vrithian scouting fleet of 12 ships had entered what their charts labeled as an unclaimed system on the outer edge of what humans called the Milky Way. The system had a single inhabited world, third from a yellow star, and initial scans had shown a species barely beginning to stretch its fingers into space, primitive sublight probes, crude radio communications bouncing around their atmosphere, and a civilization that, by every metric the Dominion used to evaluate potential assets, should have been simple to absorb. The standard procedure was efficient, even merciful in the Vrithian view: arrive, broadcast the terms of integration, accept surrender, and begin the process of folding the new species into the Dominion's vast machinery. It had worked on 31 species before humanity, and not one of those species had managed to resist for longer than a single planetary rotation. The Vrithian scouts had broadcast their terms. They had received, in return, a response that their translation matrices had initially refused to process because the language contained so many variations in tone and implied meaning that the system kept flagging it as corrupted data. When the translation finally resolved, the lead scout had read it twice, then called his superior, who had read it 3 times, and then that superior had forwarded it up the chain of command with a note that simply read, "These creatures appear to be malfunctioning." The human response, delivered with what recordings later confirmed was a cheerful, almost casual energy, had been something along the lines of, "Thanks for reaching out. We're going to need some time to think about this. In the meantime, maybe don't come any closer. We'd hate for things to get complicated." They had been warned. Everyone agreed on that point, even now. The humans had warned them. What followed over the next 17 years had been a masterclass in what the Vrithian High Command had eventually labeled, through gritted mandibles and considerable wounded pride, as asymmetric resistance from an anomalous biological unit. In plain language, humanity had been an absolute nightmare. Every probe the Dominion sent was met with responses ranging from diplomatic delay tactics to outright ambushes that left Vrithian crews confused about what had just happened to them. Humanity didn't fight the way any species the Dominion had encountered fought. They didn't stand their ground in honorable formations. They didn't sacrifice their fleets in dramatic last stands. They retreated, vanished, reappeared somewhere unexpected, hit hard, disappeared again, and somehow always managed to make the Vrithian forces feel like they were chasing shadows through a maze that kept rearranging itself. 7 full invasion attempts had been launched over those 17 years. All 7 had failed, each one more expensively than the last, and each failure had added another layer of institutional frustration to the Vrithian High Command's relationship with the small blue world that simply would not cooperate with being conquered. But Admiral Cathera was not his predecessors. He had studied every one of those 7 failures with the obsessive attention of a scholar, dissecting them, cataloging every human tactic, every feint, every retreat that turned into a trap, every ambush that had torn apart Vrithian formations that should have been invincible. He had written a 700-page tactical analysis that the High Command had received with the kind of stunned silence that precedes either great praise or great alarm, and which had ultimately earned him command of the largest single military force the Dominion had assembled in 3 centuries. He understood the humans now, or at least he believed he did, which in hindsight would turn out to be the most expensive misunderstanding in Vrithian history. The key insight in Cathera's analysis was simple: humanity won by making their enemies come to them. Every single defeat the Dominion had suffered had followed the same basic shape: Vrithian forces advance, humans retreat; Vrithian forces pursue into unfamiliar territory, humans strike from positions of advantage. The solution, therefore, was equally simple. Don't pursue. Don't be drawn in. Bring so much force, so overwhelmingly concentrated and impossible to ignore, that the humans would have no choice but to meet it directly. Flood their space with such an undeniable wave of firepower that retreat became meaningless, that their tricks and feints had no room to breathe, that their strategic genius had no canvas to paint on. 347 warships. Enough to engage a full human defensive fleet 3 times over and still have reserves. Enough to hit every human colony, every military installation, every shipyard simultaneously, with nothing left over for clever maneuvering. This was not an invasion force. This was a statement. And yet, even as Cathera watched the stars ahead and felt that deep violet satisfaction cycling through his bioluminescent markings, something small and cold lived in a corner of his mind that he refused to look at directly. A detail from his research that he had filed away, analyzed, explained away, and still couldn't quite silence. In every one of the 7 failed invasions, without exception, the humans had known the Vrithian fleets were coming. Not suspected. Not prepared for the possibility. Known, with a precision that had allowed them to position their forces, prepare their traps, and execute their ambushes with a timing that should have been impossible. His analysis had attributed this to superior sensor technology, to extensive spy networks in Vrithian space, to the humans' apparently extraordinary intelligence-gathering capabilities. These were all reasonable explanations. They were probably correct. He had moved on. He just hadn't quite managed to stop thinking about it. Admiral Commander Velshan, his second-in-command, appeared at his elbow with the particular bearing of someone delivering news they're not entirely comfortable with. We are receiving a transmission from the outer marker buoys. Automated. Appears to have been placed there in advance. Cathera turned from the viewport. Origin? Human, sir. Velshan's neck markings flickered briefly through an uncertain amber. It's addressed to you. By name. The cold thing in the corner of Cathera's mind grew slightly larger. He straightened, clasped his hands behind his back, and kept his expression composed. Play it. The bridge speakers carried a human voice, and it was remarkable, even now, how much character these creatures packed into their vocal communications, how much information their voices carried beyond mere words. The voice was unhurried, warm in a way that felt entirely inappropriate given the context, and faintly amused in a register that Cathera's translation implant rendered as something between confidence and the particular relaxed quality of someone who has already seen how a story ends. Admiral Cathera, the voice said, we've been watching your fleet assemble for about 8 months now. Beautiful ships, by the way, your engineering teams really outdid themselves this time. We wanted to extend a formal welcome as you enter what we consider our home territory. We've prepared something special. We think you're going to find it very educational. Safe travels. Then, after a pause so brief it might have been imagined, you're right on schedule. The bridge was very quiet for a moment. You're right on schedule. Not we expected you or we knew you were coming. Right on schedule. as though the entire movement of 347 warships across dozens of light years had been not just anticipated but timed. As though somewhere, in some human planning room, there was a document that included the Vrithian fleet's arrival as a line item with a projected date, and that date had been accurate. Cathera considered the transmission for exactly 4 seconds before he made his decision, because he was, whatever else might be said about him, not a coward and not a fool in the conventional sense. He recognized that the message was designed to unsettle him, to plant doubt, to make him hesitate or second-guess or perhaps even retreat. That was the human way, psychological pressure layered on top of military action, the attempt to win the battle in the enemy's mind before it was won in space. He would not give them that victory. He had 347 warships and the most carefully constructed tactical plan in Vrithian military history. A pre-recorded message, however unsettling its phrasing, was not a reason to stop. "Continue on course," he said. "All ships maintain formation. Increase sensor sweep radius to maximum." He paused. "And find me where that transmission originated." What the sensors found, as the fleet pressed deeper into what the Vrithian charts labeled the Sol Approach Corridor, was initially reassuring and then, in a way that arrived slowly and then all at once, profoundly not reassuring at all. The corridor, a relatively narrow band of navigable space between 2 dense asteroid fields that represented the most direct approach to the inner human systems, was clear. Completely, almost perfectly clear. No mines. No defensive platforms. No debris fields rigged with explosive charges. No waiting ambush fleets lurking in sensor shadow. The human defense network that Vrithian intelligence had mapped over years of careful observation appeared to be either absent or withdrawn, and the readings showed nothing between the fleet and the inner systems except open space and the distant glow of stars. This, as it happened, was the most alarming thing Cathera had ever seen in his military career, and he had once watched a moon explode. In every previous invasion, humanity had defended the approach corridors. Aggressively, creatively, at great cost to themselves. They had mined the lanes, built defensive stations, positioned fleets, created kill zones of such elegant lethality that Vrithian war analysts had spent years mapping them out with something close to admiration. Humanity did not cede space it intended to hold. If the corridor was clear, there were only 2 explanations: either humanity had abandoned this approach because they lacked the forces to defend it, or humanity had cleared it deliberately because they wanted the Vrithian fleet to use it. Cathera had, in his 700-page analysis, a full chapter on human tactical philosophy, and one line from that chapter arrived in his memory with the particular insistence of something important: the human species has never, in 17 years of documented conflict, abandoned a defensive position without an ulterior purpose. Every withdrawal in the historical record was, in retrospect, an invitation. He stopped the fleet. Not a retreat, his pride and his judgment both refused that, but a halt, 3 light hours into the corridor, while he convened an emergency analysis session with his senior staff and demanded answers. The debate that followed was intense and, in the way of military arguments everywhere in the galaxy, somewhat circular. Half his senior commanders saw the clear corridor as confirmation of their superiority. The humans were outmatched, had pulled back to consolidate their remaining forces, and the fleet should press on immediately before that consolidation could be completed. The other half shared something of Cathera's unease and argued for caution, for slower advance, for more thorough scanning of the asteroid fields on either side of the corridor. The arguments were still ongoing when the second message arrived. This one came from directly ahead, from a point in space that scans confirmed was completely empty, which meant the transmission was being relayed through some mechanism the fleet's sensors couldn't locate, which was itself a demonstration of capability that added a layer of chill to an already uncomfortable situation. The voice was different this time, older, or at least it carried the particular quality that Cathera's implant associated with authority and experience, the kind of calm that exists on the far side of having faced enough danger that it no longer registers as anything other than a problem to be solved. Admiral Cathera. I'm General Amara Osei Mensa, United Earth Defense Command. I want to be straightforward with you, because I think you deserve that much, given how far you've come. A pause. You're in a corridor that we have spent 4 years preparing specifically for your fleet. I know you know that, because you're smart enough to have gotten this far. The question you're wrestling with right now is whether it's too late to do something useful about it, and I want to help you think through that clearly. Another pause, and in that pause was a silence that felt, somehow, inhabited. It's not too late. But the window is closing. I'd suggest you use the next 20 minutes wisely. This is a genuine offer, Admiral, not a trick. We would very much prefer to resolve this without what happens next, happening. But the choice is yours. The transmission ended. 20 minutes. Cathera stood absolutely still for approximately 3 seconds, then turned to his fleet communications officer. Get me a channel to every ship commander. Now. His mind was moving very fast, discarding possibilities, prioritizing information, trying to find the shape of what was actually happening around him. General Osei Mensa had said 4 years. The Dominion had been planning this offensive for 3 years. Which meant that before the Dominion had decided to build this fleet, humanity had begun preparing for it. Which meant, with a certainty that settled in Cathera's chest like cold stone, that the humans had known about the fleet before the Dominion had decided to build it. That was not intelligence gathering. That was something else. That was something that required an explanation he didn't have. The sensor suite that his science officer had been running on the asteroid fields on either side of the corridor chose this moment to return its results, and the science officer's voice, when she reported, carried a quality that Cathera associated with someone who has discovered something so far outside their expectations that their brain is still trying to catch up with their mouth. Admiral. The asteroid fields. A pause. They're not natural. Cathera turned slowly. Explain. The composition is wrong. The distribution pattern is wrong. The density variations are wrong. She looked up from her display, and her neck markings had gone completely white, the Vrethian expression for something that had no emotional category because it was simply too large. They've been constructed. Both fields, flanking the entire corridor. The asteroids are shells. They're filled with something our sensors are reading as dormant but not inert. She paused again. Admiral, the mass readings suggest there's more material in those fields than would fit in the asteroid casings we can see. There are spaces inside them. Large spaces. She looked at the display one more time, then back at him. I think the fields are hollow. I think there's something inside them. A lot of somethings. The cold thing in Cathera's mind had, by this point, stopped being a small thing in a corner and had expanded to fill a considerable portion of his awareness. He looked at the viewport, at the clear, inviting corridor stretching ahead, at the asteroid fields on both sides that were not asteroid fields, and he experienced a sensation that his species' emotional vocabulary had a word for but which translated imperfectly into human language as something between the moment you realize you've been walking toward the edge of something and the moment your foot finds air. Get me that channel, he said quietly. I need to speak to General Osei Mensa. But even as his communications officer worked to establish the link, the scanners began registering something new, and it wasn't coming from the asteroid fields. It was coming from behind them, from the direction they had entered the corridor, from the space they had already passed through. Multiple contacts, appearing on the sensors with the particular signature of ships that had been running dark and cold and silent, tucked into positions that the fleet's sensors had passed over because there was nothing obvious to find, gradually powering up their systems in a sequence that Cathera recognized with awful clarity as pre-combat initialization. He counted them automatically, professionally, because that was what his training did even when the rest of him was processing something much larger. He counted them and then he counted them again, because the first count had produced a number he hadn't been prepared for, and military discipline required confirmation before accepting data that dramatic. 116 human warships had just materialized behind his fleet. They hadn't come from the asteroid fields. They hadn't dropped out of faster-than-light travel, which would have been detectable. They had been there, positioned in space, running with their power signatures suppressed to a level that the Dominion's sensors had read as background radiation, since before the Vrithian fleet had entered the corridor. They had let 347 warships fly past them, in some cases past them at very close range, without registering as anything other than the empty dark. Cathera stared at the sensor returns and felt the shape of it assemble itself in his mind with the slow, terrible clarity of a picture that you only understand is upside down once you see it right side up. The corridor hadn't been cleared. It had been prepared. His fleet wasn't at the front of an invasion. It was inside something that had been built to contain it. His communications officer looked up. "Admiral. I have General Osei Mensa." Cathera took a slow breath. The bioluminescent patterns on his neck had gone through several colors in the last 30 seconds and had settled, with a kind of involuntary honesty, on a deep and complex amber that his species displayed in the presence of something that had surpassed their ability to categorize it neatly. He walked to the communications station with the careful deliberateness of someone who has decided that dignity, at this particular moment, is the most important thing left to hold on to. "General," he said, when the channel confirmed is open. "I believe I owe you 20 minutes of my very close attention." And from the speaker, warm and unhurried and carrying that quality of someone who had seen this end before it began, General Amara Osei Mensa said simply, "Thank you, Admiral. Let's talk." The silence that followed General Osei Mensa's words was not the silence of empty space, though there was plenty of that surrounding 347 Vrithian warships currently positioned inside what Admiral Cathera was rapidly understanding to be the most sophisticated military trap in recorded galactic history. It was the silence of a very intelligent being taking a very careful inventory of his options and finding that the inventory, while not yet complete, was trending in a direction he didn't prefer. Cathera stood at the communications station with his hands clasped behind his back, a posture he had cultivated over 40 years of military service specifically because it projected composure regardless of what was happening inside his chest, and he let the silence breathe for exactly 3 seconds before he spoke, because 3 seconds was long enough to demonstrate that he was not panicking without being long enough to suggest he was stalling. "General Osei Mensa," he said, and his translator rendered his voice into the particular frequency-layered pattern that human communication systems recognized as formal Vrithian address, "I will extend you the same directness you offered me. My fleet is currently reading 116 of your warships positioned at our entry vector. My science officer has determined that the asteroid formations flanking our corridor position are artificial constructions of considerable mass and unknown interior content. And I received your transmission approximately 16 minutes ago, which means by your own count, I have approximately 4 minutes remaining in whatever window you referenced." He paused. "I am not a being who responds well to pressure, General. But I am a being who responds very well to information. So before this window closes, I would appreciate knowing what exactly is inside those asteroid formations." There was a pause on the other end of the channel, not the pause of someone formulating an answer, but the pause of someone deciding how much of the truth to deliver and in what order. When General Osei Mensa spoke again, her voice carried the same unhurried quality as before, but underneath it, if Cathera's 17 years of studying human communication had taught him anything, was the specific cadence of someone who was being genuinely, completely honest, which was somehow more unsettling than any deception would have been. "Admiral, inside those formations are 712 autonomous combat platforms, each one carrying enough directed energy payload to disable a Vrithian-class heavy warship in a single sustained burst. They're networked, which means they don't require individual targeting decisions. The system manages engagement sequencing on its own, faster than any crew can respond to. They've been in position for 14 months. Another pause. There are also, in the deep structure of the corridor itself, gravitational anchor mines positioned at every viable exit vector. Not to destroy ships. To hold them. The distinction matters, and I want you to understand it clearly, because it tells you something about what we're trying to accomplish here." Her voice shifted slightly, dropping a register in a way that Cathera's implant flagged as sincerity marker, a vocal quality humans apparently deployed unconsciously when they meant what they were saying more than usual. "We don't want to destroy your fleet, Admiral. We want to end this. Permanently and completely, in a way that doesn't require us to do this again in another 17 years. Cathera absorbed this with the exterior stillness of a deep-water creature and the interior activity of someone running calculations at considerable speed. 712 autonomous platforms. Gravitational anchors at every exit vector. 116 warships behind him. And somewhere in the artificial asteroid fields, waiting with the patient certainty of a mechanism rather than a military force, a system that didn't need a crew to make decisions because it had already made them all in advance. He was, by any honest assessment, not looking at a battle. He was looking at a predetermined outcome that had been engineered with extraordinary care by people who had, apparently, been thinking about this specific moment for longer than his fleet had existed. You said 14 months, he said. The platforms have been in position 14 months. Yes. My fleet took 11 months to assemble. We know. Which means you began positioning the platforms 3 months before my fleet existed. The pause this time was fractionally longer than the others, and in that fraction was something that Cathera decided, later, was the closest thing to respect that two military commanders on opposite sides of an impossible situation could exchange without words. Yes, General Osamensa said. Admiral, I think you already understand what that means, and I think you're the kind of officer who would rather have it confirmed than dance around it. Cathera's neck markings moved through a slow, involuntary cycle. You knew we were going to build the fleet before we decided to build it. We knew you were going to build something. We've been watching your strategic decision-making cycles for a long time. The Dominion responds to failure with escalation. It's consistent. It's been consistent across every engagement we've had with you, and frankly it's consistent with what we know about how your high command functions politically. After the 7th failed invasion, escalation to a force of this scale was not just predictable. It was, from a certain analytical perspective, inevitable. She paused. We just made sure we were ready for inevitable. Commander Velshan had appeared at Cathera's side at some point during this exchange, close enough to hear the transmission, and the amber of his neck markings matched Cathera's almost exactly, the involuntary color coordination of two beings experiencing the same very large, very specific category of realization simultaneously. Velshan said nothing, because there was nothing to add, and because he was a good enough officer to recognize that what was happening on this communications channel was more important than anything he could contribute to it. He simply stood there, and the two of them listened, and outside the viewports 347 warships drifted in a corridor that had been built for them the way a specific kind of vessel is built for a specific kind of cargo. You mentioned ending this, Cathera said. Permanently and completely. I need you to define those terms precisely, General, because in my experience, permanent solutions in warfare tend to involve the elimination of one party's capacity to continue, and I want to know which direction you're proposing. I'm proposing neither, she said. Or more accurately, I'm proposing both, but not through destruction. There was a sound in the background of her transmission that Cathera's audio processors identified as the ambient noise of a large room with many people in it, which meant she was not alone, which meant whatever she said next had been heard and approved by an audience he couldn't see. Admiral, the Vrithian Dominion has been attempting to conquer Earth for 17 years. In that time, you've lost 7 fleets, thousands of ships, and a number of personnel that I suspect your high command has stopped reporting accurately to avoid the political consequences. We have spent 17 years, and a significant portion of our entire planetary economy, building and maintaining the defensive infrastructure you're currently sitting inside. This is not sustainable for either of us. A pause. What I am proposing is a demonstration. Not a negotiation yet, a demonstration. I want you to understand, with absolute clarity, what the outcome of engaging this system would look like, so that when we do have a negotiation, it begins from a foundation of shared reality rather than mutual optimism. Cathera considered this for a moment. You want to show me what happens if I fight? I want to show you what happens if your fleet fights, yes. Not to humiliate you. Not to break your people's spirit. Because I need you to go home and report something true, and I need what you report to be something that the Vrithian High Command cannot dismiss as exaggeration or cowardice or propaganda." She paused. "I need them to believe it. Which means I need you to believe it first." What happened next would, in later years, be described in very different terms depending on who was doing the describing. Human military historians would call it the corridor demonstration, and would write about it with the particular dry precision of people documenting a technical exercise. Vrithian military historians, the ones who wrote about it at all, given that the subject carried considerable political sensitivity in the Dominion for decades afterward, would use language that was more varied and considerably more uncomfortable, reaching for metaphors that tried to capture the specific quality of watching something that was not quite a battle and not quite a surrender but was somehow more final than either. General Osei-Mensah had asked for 20 minutes. She had not specified 20 minutes for conversation. 6 minutes after the channel opened, while Kathera and Osei-Mensah were still talking, the autonomous platform network inside the asteroid formations ran what the humans called a calibration sequence, which was a somewhat understated name for what it actually was. 17 platforms, out of 712, activated simultaneously in a pattern distributed across the entire length and width of the corridor. They did not fire at the Vrithian fleet. They fired at 17 pre-selected points in open space between the fleet and the asteroid walls, and what the Vrithian sensors recorded in the next 4 seconds was the simultaneous creation of 17 contained energy events, each one lasting precisely 0.8 seconds, each one producing a sensor signature that the fleet's combat analysis system immediately flagged, cross-referenced, and then flagged again because the first flag had produced an output it wasn't designed to handle. Each of those 17 events would have disabled a Vrithian heavy warship. Not destroyed. Disabled, systems down, crew alive, hull intact, but effectively inert. The system had fired 17 shots into empty space and every single one of them would have been a clean, precise, survivable disabling strike if a ship had been in the target zone. The combat analysis system extrapolated from 17 simultaneous shots to the full 712 platforms firing in coordinated sequence, and the number it produced, the projected time to disable the entire Vrithian fleet if the system engaged at full capacity, was displayed on Kathera's bridge screen in large, clear numerals, 4 minutes and 17 seconds. 347 warships. 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Velshan made a sound. It was very quiet and entirely involuntary, and Kathera pretended not to hear it because he was making a similar effort with his own vocal cords. He looked at the number on the screen, and then he looked at it again, and his neck markings did something they had never done in 40 years of military service. They went completely still. Not white, not amber, not any of the colors that map to known emotional states. Just still, which was what Vrithian bioluminescence did when the system encountered inputs so far outside its normal parameters that it defaulted to baseline. "You've seen the calibration," General Osei-Mensah said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Kathera said. His voice was very even. "Military discipline, 40 years of it, was an extraordinary thing." "Then you have a reasonably accurate picture," she said. "Admiral, I want to be very clear about something. The Human Defense Command did not build this system to use it. We built it to not use it. We built it so that we would never have to use it, because what we actually want, what we have always actually wanted, is to be left alone. We are not an expansionist species. We have never attempted to take territory from the Dominion. We have never attacked the Dominion system. Every engagement in 17 years of conflict has taken place in our space, on our terms, because we were responding to incursions, not initiating them." Her voice was steady but carried that undercurrent of something larger, something that had been carrying weight for a long time and was choosing its words around that weight very carefully. "We are very, very good at defending ourselves, Admiral. We have had a lot of practice. But being good at defense is not the same as wanting to fight, and I need your high command to understand that distinction, because the alternative to them understanding it is this corridor, and what happens in it, and I do not want that outcome." Kathera was quiet for a long moment. Outside the viewports, the 17 energy dissipation clouds from the calibration sequence were fading, spreading thin, becoming indistinguishable from background radiation. The corridor was clear again. Perfectly, invitingly clear, with its hollow asteroid walls and its exit vectors pinned by gravitational anchors and its 116 human warships sitting patiently behind him, powered up and ready and making no aggressive move whatsoever, which was somehow more impressive than aggression would have been. "General," he said finally, "I have a question that is not tactical." A pause. "Ask it. How long have you been doing this?" Not the preparations for this specific engagement. The larger thing. The 17 years of it. Because I have studied every engagement in our conflict extensively, and I have never been able to fully account for the quality of your intelligence. Your positioning has been too precise, your timing too accurate, your understanding of our decision-making too complete. I attributed it to excellent intelligence networks. He paused. "But you knew about my fleet before we decided to build it. And I would like to know how." The pause on General Osei-Mensah's end was the longest one yet. Long enough that Cathera wondered, for a moment, if she would answer at all. When she did, her voice had a different quality, not warmer, exactly, but more personal, as if the general had stepped slightly to one side and let the human being standing behind the rank speak for a moment. "Admiral, when humanity first made contact with the wider galactic community 17 years ago, we were, by galactic standards, very young. Our technology was primitive in many ways that mattered. But we had something that older species sometimes lose, because they stop being surprised by the universe often enough to keep developing it." She paused. "We are exceptionally good at watching patterns and predicting behavior. Not because we have some special gift, because we've spent our entire history as a species surrounded by other beings and environments that could end us, and surviving required learning to read what was going to happen before it happened. It's not mystical. It's practice, accumulated over a very long time, applied to a new context." Another pause. "We watched the Dominion for 17 years, Admiral. We watched how you make decisions. We watched what your high command responds to, what pressures it responds to, what political cycles drive your military planning. We built models. We ran predictions. And we prepared for the outcomes those predictions indicated." A brief silence. "You were not wrong to come here. Given your high command's decision-making framework and the political pressures following the 7th failed invasion, you were almost certainly the best commander they had, with the best plan they could conceive, carrying the best fleet they could build. None of that was wrong. It was just aimed at something that had been expecting it." Cathera stood with this for a moment, the weight of it, the sheer scope of what it implied. Not just for this engagement, but for every engagement before it. For 17 years of a conflict that, understood correctly, had never been as uncertain as the Dominion believed, because one side had been reading the other with a clarity the other side hadn't known was possible. He thought about the 7 failed invasions. He thought about the losses, the ships, the people, the resources stripped from conquered systems to fuel a war effort that had been, in some profound sense, already answered before the questions were asked. He thought about the High Command's boardrooms and their confident projections and their escalating force commitments, and he thought about what it meant that all of it had been, from a certain vantage point, simply input data for a system that had been modeling their behavior and preparing responses for 17 years. "General," he said, and something in his voice had changed, not broken, not defeated, but recalibrated, the way a compass recalibrates after encountering a magnetic field strong enough to matter. "I am going to ask you something that is outside my authority to offer but within my authority to attempt. I want to speak to my fleet commanders. All of them, simultaneously. And then I want to speak to you again, with them listening. Because what you have told me and what I have seen in this corridor is something that 347 ships full of Vreethian military officers need to understand, not as a report they will receive later, sanitized and reframed by High Command, but as a direct experience. And after that conversation, I want to discuss the terms of what you called an ending. A real one. Not an armistice. Not a ceasefire. An ending." There was a pause, and in it Cathera could hear, very faintly, the ambient sounds of the room full of people that had been in the background of General Osamensa's transmissions throughout their conversation. He couldn't hear what they were saying to each other, but the texture of the sound changed, became briefly more active, more varied, and then settled again. "Give me 5 minutes," she said. "I need to make a call of my own." Those 5 minutes were among the more remarkable 5 minutes in Cathera's career, not because of anything dramatic that happened in them but because of the quality of the waiting. He stood on the bridge of the Sovereign Eternal and looked out at the corridor and at the artificial asteroid formations and at the sensor returns showing 116 human ships sitting patiently behind him, and he thought about 4 minutes and 17 seconds, and about 14 months of preparation, and about a general who had sent him a personal message, welcoming him by name before he arrived, and about the word inevitable used not as a threat but as an analytical conclusion. And he thought about 31 species folded into the Dominion's machinery, and about what it said about the machinery that it had encountered one species that refused to be folded and had responded by building larger and larger tools to force the folding, while the species simply kept watching, and modeling, and preparing. When General Osamensa's channel reopened, she had company. The voice that spoke first was not hers, and it carried the particular quality of someone speaking from a position of considerable authority, the kind of authority that doesn't need to announce itself because it's audible in the simple architecture of how the words are arranged. "Admiral Cathera. My name is Director Yashvili. I represent the United Earth Diplomatic Council. General Osamensa has briefed me on the substance of your conversation, and I want you to know that your request has been heard and we are prepared to facilitate it." A pause. "Before we do, I want to offer you something. Not a demand. Not a condition. An offer, freely made." Another pause. "We are going to open a channel to every ship in your fleet simultaneously. And before your commanders hear from you, they are going to see something. We are going to show them what this corridor looks like from our sensor perspective, the full picture, the complete tactical situation, rendered in a format their systems can process. No interpretation, no framing. Just data. Because we believe that when military professionals see accurate data, they make better decisions than when they receive filtered information from a chain of command with political pressures. And we believe that better decisions, right now, lead to an outcome that is better for everyone in this corridor, including the people in your fleet." Cathera looked at Velshan. Velshan looked back at him, and his neck markings had moved from white through several uncertain colors and arrived at something that, in a different context, Cathera might have identified as reluctant agreement. The Admiral turned back to the communications station. "Transmit your data," he said. What followed, across 347 Vrithian warships, was a kind of collective realization that had no clean military category. The human sensor feed arrived simultaneously on every ship's main display, rendered with a clarity that Vrithian sensor technology couldn't quite match: cleaner signals, broader spectrum, deeper resolution, and what it showed was the corridor as the humans saw it. Every hollow formation. Every platform position within the asteroid shells, individually marked, individually numbered, 712 of them glowing on the display like a constellation that had been deliberately arranged. Every gravitational anchor mine, marked with precise mass readings and effect radius calculations. The 116 human warships behind them, which from the human sensor perspective were not hidden at all, were simply sitting there, clearly visible in the feed, positioned with the relaxed patience of forces that have done what they need to do and are now simply waiting for events to conclude. And in the center of the display, marked with a different color than everything else, was the Vrithian fleet itself. 347 ships, displayed from the outside, from the perspective of the trap looking in. It was, Cathera reflected, a peculiar and specific kind of experience, seeing yourself as the thing inside the container rather than the thing moving through open space, and he suspected that across his fleet, in 347 bridge crews, that experience was landing with a weight that no amount of verbal description could have produced. He opened the fleet-wide channel. He spoke for 11 minutes, without notes and without the particular careful framing that military communications between commanders and their forces usually employed. He told them what he had learned. He told them about the 14 months of preparation and the 4 minutes and 17 seconds and the 700-year pattern of Dominion decision-making that had been modeled and predicted by a species that the Dominion had spent 17 years trying to conquer because it refused to acknowledge that the species was doing something worth paying attention to. He told them about 31 absorbed civilizations and about one civilization that had not been absorbed and about what that asymmetry actually meant if you thought about it clearly instead of through the lens of institutional pride. He did not tell them what to feel. He told them what was true, and he left the feeling to them, because they were military professionals and military professionals, at their best, preferred truth to comfort when truth was what the situation required. Then he reopened the channel to General Osei Mensa and Director Yashvili, with the fleet-wide link still active so that every commander could hear every word, and he said, "We are ready to discuss terms." What followed in the next 2 hours was not a negotiation in the conventional military sense, not the grinding, positional exchange of demands and concessions that characterized most post-engagement settlements. It was something different, something that the diplomatic historians who would eventually write about it would struggle to categorize cleanly, because it had qualities of surrender and qualities of treaty and qualities of something that didn't have a standard name, which was two military forces on opposite sides of a very large power asymmetry discovering that one of them had never wanted what the other one thought it wanted. The humans did not want territory. They did not want reparations, though they had grounds for substantial ones. They did not want a formal acknowledgement of military superiority, though the corridor had established that beyond any reasonable argument. What they wanted was, by the standards of galactic geopolitics, almost disarmingly simple. They wanted the Dominion to leave them alone, formally, permanently, in a document that carried enough weight that it would hold regardless of changes in Dominion leadership or political pressure or the temptation of future high commands to revisit the question. And in exchange for that, in exchange for the simple, uncomplicated peace of being left alone, they were prepared to offer something that the Dominion had not expected and could not have predicted even with 17 years of human behavioral modeling to draw from, because it was the kind of offer that only makes sense from a species that has never been primarily interested in conquest and is therefore free to think about what it actually wants from the universe. They offered technology. Specific, carefully selected, immediately applicable technology in the fields of sensor systems, autonomous platform engineering, and the particular category of gravitational mechanics that had produced the anchor mines, offered not as a demonstration of superiority but as a practical foundation for a different kind of relationship, the kind where two civilizations interact because the interaction produces something neither could produce alone, rather than the kind where one civilization interacts with another by attempting to remove its independence. They offered access to human space, selectively and on human terms, for trade and exchange that the Dominion's absorbed species had never been permitted to engage in because the Dominion's economic model was extractive rather than reciprocal. They offered, in careful and precise diplomatic language that Director Yashvili delivered with the patience of someone who had been preparing this particular speech for a considerable amount of time, the possibility of a future that looked fundamentally different from the 17-year past that had brought 347 warships to a corridor full of traps. Kethera listened to all of it. He asked questions that were pointed and specific and demonstrated that he was processing the proposals with the full capacity of a mind that had spent 40 years thinking about strategy. His commanders, listening on the fleet-wide channel, offered occasional questions of their own, some skeptical, some logistical, a few that were simply the natural response of military professionals trying to understand a situation that had moved significantly outside the parameters of their training. And the humans answered every question with a directness that was, by any objective measure, unusual for diplomatic communications, but which made a certain kind of sense given that the alternative to directness in this particular corridor was 4 minutes and 17 seconds of something that nobody in the conversation wanted. It took 2 hours and 40 minutes to reach the framework of what would eventually become the Corridor Accord, named, with human directness, for where it was negotiated. The formal document would take several more weeks of detailed work, involving diplomats and lawyers and technical specialists from both civilizations, and would ultimately run to several hundred pages of carefully constructed language. But the essential shape of it was determined in that corridor, in those 2 hours and 40 minutes, between an admiral who had come to conquer and a general who had built an extraordinary machine specifically so she would never have to use it. When the framework was agreed, when Cathera had transmitted the outline to his fleet and received from his commanders the responses, not enthusiastic, most of them, but considered and professional and clear-eyed in the way of people who have seen accurate data and are making decisions based on it, General Osemensa spoke one more time on the open channel. Her voice had the same quality it had carried throughout, unhurried, warm, that undertone of someone who has been carrying significant weight for a long time and has just felt it shift. "Admiral Cathera," she said, "I want to tell you something that isn't in the agreement and isn't a diplomatic position. It's just true." A pause. "We never wanted this to be a war. We wanted it to be a first contact. 17 years ago, when your scouts arrived and broadcast their terms, we weren't angry. We were excited. We had just found out we weren't alone in the universe, and the feeling was extraordinary, even complicated as the circumstances were. We spent 17 years fighting to stay ourselves, to stay free, to be able to make our own choices, but what we were fighting for was also the right to eventually have a different kind of relationship with the species we were fighting. Because that's what we do. That's what we are." Another pause. "We are ready to stop fighting, Admiral. We have been ready to stop fighting for 17 years. We just needed the other side to be ready too." Cathera stood at the viewport of the Sovereign Eternal for a long time after the channel closed, looking at the corridor and its hollow asteroids and its waiting platforms and its patient darkness, and he thought about what it meant to be a species that built the most sophisticated military trap in galactic history and then used it to start a conversation. He thought about 17 years and 7 failed invasions and 31 absorbed civilizations and one civilization that had simply, stubbornly, extraordinarily refused, and he thought about what it said about the universe that the most formidable military force he had ever encountered had been built, fundamentally, in the service of peace. Then he straightened, clasped his hands behind his back in the posture of 40 years of military composure, and turned to Commander Velshan. "Plot a course back to Dominion space," he said. "Standard formation, no combat configuration. And get me a channel to High Command. I have a report to deliver, and I want them to hear every word of it clearly, because it is going to be the most important report they have ever received, and I will not have it summarized or filtered or softened by anyone between me and them." He paused. "Tell them the trap worked. Tell them it worked exactly as intended. And tell them that the species that built it would very much like to discuss what comes next." Velshan nodded, and his neck markings had settled, finally, into a color that Vrithian emotional vocabulary classified as something between relief and the particular quality of awe that arrives not with thunder but with the quiet recognition that you are in the presence of something that has permanently changed the shape of what you thought was possible. Outside the viewports, the corridor began to change. The asteroid formations, all 14 months of careful construction, all 712 platforms, began, slowly and without drama, to go dark. Not destroyed, not dismantled. Simply powered down, returned to dormancy, their demonstration complete and their purpose, for now, fulfilled. The gravitational anchors released their holds on the exit vectors one by one, and the corridor opened, and 347 Vrithian warships turned, in formation, and began to move toward home. The 116 human warships that had waited behind them with such patient, extraordinary stillness did not follow. They simply held their positions, watching, as the fleet that had come to end humanity passed back through the threshold it had crossed with such confidence 14 hours earlier, and headed back toward the stars it had come from, carrying something it hadn't brought with it, the beginning of a different understanding of what the universe was and what it could be, delivered not by conquest, not by destruction, but by the most human method imaginable, by building something magnificent and then using it to start a conversation. The corridor was quiet after they left. The stars were the same as they had always been, indifferent and eternal and vast. And somewhere in the inner systems of the world the Vrithian Dominion had spent 17 years trying to reach, on a small blue planet orbiting an ordinary yellow star, a general sat in a large room full of people who had been holding their breath for a very long time, and finally, quietly, let it go. And